Hi everyone, my name is Kristin Scott. I'm an RN to BSN student here at Bloomsburg University, currently taking Political Science 181, Contemporary Issues in World Politics. I'm going to be talking about sexual violence as a weapon of war. So first of all, what is it? Sexual violence as a weapon of war is commonly referred to as conflict-related sexual violence. It refers to the many different acts of sexual violence used as a tactic in war. It's often used to gain political or military advantage in conflict settings. The main perpetrators of these attacks are often political militias or state forces. Though it's been a challenge throughout history to stop these attacks and bring justice to its victims, it is recognized as one of the most severe human rights violations and one of the most serious violations of international law. It is used not only to torment victims, but it's a psychological warfare intended to punish, intimidate, and destroy communities. So what are the forms of sexual violence? As you can see here, there are many forms. Under international law and in the work of the United Nations, there are 8 different recognized forms for conflict-related sexual violence. These include rape, gang rape, sexual slavery, prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, enforced sterilization, forced marriage. And there's also other forms of sexual violence in comparable gravity, like sexual torture, penetration with objects and weapons. And all of these tactics are used to humiliate and destroy the sexual identity of the victim, and as previously mentioned, instill fear in the community. Now we're going to talk about the impacts of sexual violence. Victims suffer not only injury and disease, but psychological and social impacts as well. Humiliation and shame are often felt by the victims, and victims are also typically excluded from their families and communities. Children born from rape face lifelong stigmatization and rejection, and communities and authorities often fail to hold the perpetrators accountable. As I mentioned previously, these acts are usually carried out by political militias, and there's a fear that goes along with it, as well as intimidation. So often these communities prefer just to maintain the status quo. Sexual violence committed in conflict settings is also associated with an increased risk in all forms of gender-based violence, including domestic abuse, child marriage, and sexual exploitation. Where does it happen? So the 2019 United Nations report reported that rape is used as a strategy of war in 15 countries around the world, mostly in Africa and the Middle East. The Democratic Republic of Congo is known as the rape capital of the world, topping the UN list of countries prone to sexual violence. And although Africa and the Middle East are the most common areas, it does happen on all continents around the world, and it's not just limited to a certain time or region. Research shows that it continues to be a problem globally and continues to impede peace and security around the world. So, as I mentioned, sexual violence as a weapon of war happens all around the world. Shown here is the visual of the 12th report of the United Nations Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence. This report includes data from conflict-affected settings, as well as sexual violence in post-conflict settings. Communities that experience conflict-related sexual violence often continue to deal with sexual abuse after the conflict has ended, for as long as the lawlessness persists. Some generations are brought up to believe that sexual violence is the norm or a common part of life. Studies vary, and the number of cases of conflict-related sexual violence often vary. The 2020 UN report shows that 2,542 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, while others report more or less. However, the one common thing in these reports is that the majority of cases go unreported. It's also important to note that a common misconception is that sexual violence is committed only against women. As you can see here, that in 2020, more than 58 cases were reported against men and boys. And although the majority of acts are committed against women and children, men are also victims. Internationally, there are numerous organizations and campaigns to prevent and combat conflict-related sexual violence, as well as provide resources for victims and their communities. Listed here are just a few. One example, as you can see listed here, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO implemented the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, focusing on sexually related violence, developed military guidelines on the prevention and response in 2015, and aimed at reducing the risk of conflict-related sexual violence and improving responsive measures. They regularly work with a range of international organizations as well as civil society actors to contribute to eliminating sexual violence. And listed down at the bottom here, there is a link, which is actually the Rape Crisis Network of Europe, which provides links and resources to a variety of international organizations. So as you can see, sexual violence continues to be a global problem, impacting individuals, communities, and countries around the world. For more information on combating conflict-related sexual violence, you can visit the following resources.